"Get off my site right now!" My corrupt CEO screamed, throwing my structural folder into the mud. He thought firing me would hide his cheap steel. He was wrong. My professional stamp was the only thing keeping his $120 M tower legal. My name is Mark Vance. At 42 years old, I have spent the last 15 years of my life calculating loads, inspecting structural welds, and checking concrete pours for high-rise projects from Seattle to San Francisco. To an outsider, structural engineering looks dry and boring. You look at drawings, run computer simulations on SAP 2000, and look at endless tables of steel specifications. But the pressure is immense. You are responsible for every pound of dead load, every gust of wind load, and ultimately the lives of thousands of office workers and residents who will occupy these structures. In the state of Washington, the law is uncompromising. Before a single yard of concrete can be poured for a structural column or shear wall, the licensed engineer must review the mill test reports, inspect the rebar placement, and electronically sign off on the municipal portal of the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections. Without that digital PE stamp, the city inspectors will post a stop work order, and the concrete batch plants are legally barred from sending their trucks to the site. Because of this responsibility, I have a reputation for being the most stubborn engineer on any job site. I do not do favors, I do not take shortcuts, and I do not care about the contractor's profit margins. To me, structural integrity is binary. A steel beam either meets the ASTM A992 grade 50 specification with a minimum yield strength of 50,000 pounds per square inch, or it belongs in the scrapyard. There is no middle ground, and there is no such thing as close enough. 3 years ago, I was hired by Sterling Structural Solutions to serve as the chief quality inspector and lead structural engineer for Sterling Heights. It was a massive undertaking. The project was a 45-story luxury mixed-use tower in the heart of downtown Seattle, boasting a budget of $120 million. The developer and general contractor was a family-owned firm that had recently been taken over by Arthur Sterling, the eldest son of the founder. Arthur was a vanity-driven executive who cared far more about appearances than engineering tolerances. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove a pristine Porsche 911, and loved to show off the project model to wealthy investors. But behind his wealthy facade lay a company drowning in debt and struggling with cash flow. The construction of Sterling Heights was funded by a $90 million loan syndicate, led by West Coast Syndicate Bank. The loan agreement contained a brutal milestone clause. The bank released funds in phases based on construction progress. If the main structural core did not reach the level 24 floor slab by October 15th, the bank would freeze all future loan draws. For Arthur, a delay of even a few days meant default, compounding interest penalties, and the potential bankruptcy of his family's legacy. He was desperate, and desperate developers do dangerous things. My days always started at 6 in the morning. I would put on my high-visibility vest, strap on my hard hat, and grab my ultrasonic testing machine for checking welds. I spent hours climbing through the raw concrete core, checking the tension of high-strength structural bolts and inspecting the structural steel columns. Everything I inspected had to be logged into the project's quality assurance database. The city's portal was automated. It matched my digital PE key with the state registry to ensure the engineer signing off was active and licensed. If my stamp was missing, the project ground to a halt. Everything went smoothly until we reached the 21st floor. That was when flatbed trucks from Thorne Steel Mills started arriving at the site. The mill was owned by Gary Thorne, Arthur's brother-in-law. Gary was a notorious figure in the local construction scene, famous for supplying B-grade structural materials while billing for premium, certified steel. I immediately felt uneasy when I saw Thorne Steel Mills listed on the material manifests. When the first batch of W-shape heavy structural steel columns arrived for the critical core framing of levels 22 through 24, I refused to accept the paperwork. Gary Thorne drove down to the site himself. He smiled, slapped me on the shoulder, and handed me a glossy mill test report with stamped heat numbers, assuring me the steel was ASTM A992 grade 50. I looked at the paperwork, then walked out to the yard to inspect the actual steel. Even to the naked eye, the quality was suspicious. The edges of the flanges were rough, the web surfaces showed microfissures, and there was excessive mill scale. I told Gary that I did not care what his printed certificate said. I only trusted the hydraulic testing machine. I ordered my techs to cut 3 test coupons from random beams and mount them in our universal testing machine in the lab. When the hydraulic piston pulled the first sample, the metal snapped. The digital readout showed a yield strength of 38 psi. The second and third samples failed similarly, snapping at 37 and 39 psi. This was standard commercial carbon steel, suitable for low-rise warehouses, but completely inadequate for a 45-story tower, designed to withstand seismic activity. If we used this steel to support the upper 23 floors, a minor earthquake could trigger a progressive collapse. I immediately spray-painted large red reject crosses across the entire shipment and logged a formal non-compliance report demanding the steel be removed from the site within 24 hours. I did not know it yet, but that rejection was a direct threat to Arthur and Gary's fraudulent scheme. They had pocketed a $1.8 million difference by buying cheap, uncertified steel. My refusal to stamp the steel not only exposed their fraud, but threatened to delay the level 24 milestone, which was now only 4 weeks away. Arthur decided that the easiest way to solve the problem was to get rid of the engineer who found it. The confrontation did not take long to materialize. At 7:30 the morning after I spray-painted those substandard steel columns, my phone vibrated. It was Arthur Sterling's secretary, telling me the CEO wanted to see me in the main project trailer immediately. I walked across the muddy site, the rain dripping from the brim of my hard hat. The site trailer was a double-wide mobile office parked near the crane pad. Inside, it smelled of stale coffee, damp paper, and heaters running on high. When I stepped into Arthur's office, he was not alone. Gary Thorne was sitting in one of the leather chairs, holding a paper cup of coffee and looking smug. Arthur was pacing behind his large, oak desks, his expensive leather shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. He did not ask me to sit. He did not even look at me at first. He just pointed at the window, which looked out over the main crane hook. "Mark, do you know how much money we lose every hour that crane sits idle because you refuse to let us erect the core columns?" Arthur asked, his voice deceptively quiet. "About $15,000 in equipment standby fees and labor costs," I replied, keeping my voice flat. "And that does not include the interest compounding on the construction loan." "Exactly," Arthur snapped, turning around to face me. "So why is there a big red cross painted on Gary's steel out there?" Gary has been running Thorne Steel Mills for 15 years. His company has supplied structural steel for half the parking garages in King County. "Because his steel fails tension testing," I said. I pulled a printed sheet from my folder and laid it on his desk. "These are the stress-strain curves from the laboratory pull tests we ran yesterday afternoon. The yield strength of the steel Gary delivered is 38 psi. The design specifications for the Sterling Heights core require ASTM A992 grade 50 steel. That means the minimum yield must be 50,000 pounds per square inch. The columns Gary sent us are 24% weaker than the design load requires. If we build the next 23 floors on top of those columns, we violate the building code, and the safety margin drops below the legal limit." Gary stood up, tossing his coffee cup into the trash. "You are being too academic, Mark. Every structural design has a safety factor of at least 1.5 or 2. The steel is fine. It is a massive block of solid metal. It is not going to snap because it is a few psi short. That safety factor is there to account for unforeseen environmental loads, like a major windstorm or an earthquake," I said, turning to Gary. "It is not there to cover up your cheap, inferior manufacturing. If I sign off on 38 psi steel and a major seismic event hits Seattle, those columns will buckle and the floors above will pancake. I am not risking my license, and I am certainly not risking human lives, just so you can save a couple of $1 million. Arthur walked over to his desk, but instead of arguing the engineering details, he sat down and opened his bottom drawer. His expression changed from frustration to a cold, calculated smirk. "Well, Mark, I agree that safety is important," Arthur said, leaning back. "In fact, we had an anonymous tip from one of the site foremen late last night. He claimed that you were acting very strangely around the subcontractor trailers. So, I had security do a quick sweep of the engineering office. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a dull thud, the flap opening to reveal thick stacks of crisp $100 bills. "We found this in the bottom drawer of your desk, Mark." $50,000 in cash, Arthur said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Gary tells me that you threatened to reject his steel unless he paid you a consulting fee under the table, and when he refused, you suddenly found a way to make his tests fail." I looked at the envelope, then at Gary, who was looking out the window, pretending to be deeply offended. The setup was incredibly sloppy, but it did not need to be perfect to work. My desk in the shared engineering trailer did not have a functioning lock. Anyone with a key to the trailer, including the night security guard who was on Arthur's payroll, could have slipped that envelope into my drawer in less than 30 seconds. "This is a joke," I said, not letting my voice shake. "You planted this. Who is going to believe that, Mark?" Arthur sneered. "We have the cash. We have a signed statement from the security guard who found it during a routine safety sweep. We have Gary's statement detailing your extortion attempt. If I call the Seattle Police Department right now, you will be escorted off this site in handcuffs. And if I file a formal complaint with the State Board of Registration for Professional Engineers, your license will be suspended before the week is over. Your career will be finished." I stood there in the quiet office, the rain drumming against the metal roof of the trailer. I realized Arthur did not want to call the police. If he did, the resulting investigation would draw attention to the project's materials, which would lead to independent testing of the steel and expose Gary's fraud anyway. This was an ultimatum. "What do you want, Arthur?" I asked. "I want this project to stay on schedule," Arthur said, sliding a structural sign-off sheet across the desk toward me. He tapped a finger next to the signature line. "You stamp and sign this approval sheet for the Thorn Steel batch. You certify that the columns meet the project specifications. Once you sign, you can take that envelope on the desk as an early retirement bonus. You can resign at the end of the month citing health reasons and walk away. But if you walk out of that door without signing, I will destroy your reputation before you reach your car." I looked down at the white paper, then at my digital PE stamp keychain hanging from my belt. If I signed that paper, I would be rich, but I would also be a criminal. If the building ever failed, I would be the one going to prison, while Arthur and Gary enjoyed their profits. But more than that, I could not live with the knowledge that I had signed off on a structure that I knew was unsafe. I looked Arthur in the eye, leaned down, and picked up my engineering folder. "I am not signing it," I said quietly. Arthur's face turned bright red, the veins in his neck bulging. He slammed both palms onto his desk, standing up. "Get off my site right now, and do not ever show your face at any construction project in this city again," he screamed. He grabbed the phone on his desk and dialed security, shouting for them to come to his office. He stepped around the desk, grabbed the security badge from my neck, and ripped it off, breaking the plastic clip. He threw the pieces onto the floor. "Get this garbage out of here!" Arthur yelled as two security guards entered the room. I did not make a scene. I did not yell back. I just looked at Arthur and Gary, memorizing the smug satisfaction on their faces. "Understood," I said calmly. I turned and walked out of the trailer, the security guards hovering closely behind me. As I walked out into the cold Seattle rain, my mind was already working. They thought they had won because they had kicked me off the physical site, but they did not understand how the system worked. They could print a forged paper, but they could not bypass the digital gatekeeper of the city's database without leaving a trail of digital breadcrumbs. I had my license, I had the truth, and I still had my private encryption key. For the first few days after my firing, I did nothing but sit in my home office and monitor the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections portal. I knew Arthur Sterling was in a corner. Changing the structural engineer of record on a $120 million municipal project is not like hiring a new subcontractor. It requires a formal application to the city, a full structural audit by the incoming engineer, and a notification to the bank. It takes weeks, and it screams to the investors that something is wrong. Arthur did not have weeks. He had less than a month before the bank's milestone deadline. On Thursday morning, I logged into the portal using my credentials. I clicked on the active permit folder for the Sterling Heights project, and my blood ran cold. The permit status for the level 22 concrete pour and core column erection had been updated to approved. I clicked on the attached structural inspection report. There it was. My name, my license number, and a digital image of my professional engineer stamp, complete with a digital signature. The report certified that the structural steel columns from Thorn Steel Mills had been inspected, tested, and found to be in full compliance with the ASTM A992 Grade 50 specifications. It was dated 2 days after I was escorted off the site. Arthur had not hired a new engineer. He had simply gone into the company's local server, found the digital vector file of my PE stamp that I used for minor submittals, and used it to forge my signature on a falsified inspection report. It was a massive federal and state crime, wire fraud, document forgery, and a direct violation of safety regulations. I needed ironclad proof that the bad steel was actually in the building, and not just sitting in the yard. I picked up my phone and called Marcus Miller. Mac was a veteran flatbed driver who had worked for Thorn Steel Mills for over a decade. During my time on site, I had always treated him with respect, bought him coffee, and listened to him complain about the company's cheap maintenance on his truck. He was an honest guy who hated Gary Thorne's cutting corners. We met at a Greasy Spoon diner in Tukwila, just south of the city. The diner was noisy, smelling of frying bacon and diesel exhaust from the highway outside. Mac was sitting in a booth, wearing his stained canvas jacket, a folder resting on the table in front of him. "I heard they threw you out, Mark," Mac said, sliding the folder toward me as I sat down. Gary was bragging about it to the shop foreman. Said they finally got rid of the bottleneck. "Did they use the rejected steel, Mac?" I asked. Opening the folder, Mac nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Every single beam. I hauled 3 of those loads myself." Gary had us reload the rejected columns from the red-marked pile at night, after the city inspectors left the site. They erected them on the level 22 core the next morning. These are the original dispatch logs, the scale tickets from the mill, and the loading manifests showing the heat numbers of the failed steel. You can match these heat numbers to the steel that is currently bolted and welded into the core walls right now. I looked at the scale tickets. The heat numbers matched my laboratory failure reports perfectly. I had them. This was the physical link, proving that the substandard steel was structural reality, not just a paperwork error. "Thank you, Mac," I said, closing the folder. "This is exactly what I needed." "Just promise me you will burn Gary down," Mac said. "He has been putting trash steel in buildings for years. It is only a matter of time before one of them collapses and kills someone." The next day, I met Robert Chen at a quiet coffee shop in the International District. Robert was my former structural analysis professor at the University of Washington, and he was now the senior deputy building official for the city of Seattle. He was a quiet, meticulous man who took building safety as seriously as I did. I showed him the forged report from the city portal and the dispatch logs Mac had given me. Robert put on his reading glasses, comparing the digital signature on the forged report with my official signature on file. "This is a cloned digital signature certificate," Robert said, his face darkening. "The security protocol shows it was uploaded from an IP address, registered to the Sterling Structural Solutions corporate office. They did not even bother to use a VPN. They just uploaded it from their main server. Mark, this is incredibly dangerous. The city cannot allow construction to continue on a tower with forged structural certifications." "Can you issue a stop work order?" I asked. "I can," Robert said. "But Arthur Sterling has powerful political connections in the city council. If I issue a stop work order based on an administrative discrepancy, his lawyers will file an injunction, claim it is a clerical error, and tie us up in court while they pour more concrete. We need to hit them from an angle they cannot fight with lawyers." I smiled. "I had already thought of that, Robert. Do you remember the transit-oriented development grant the project received?" I asked. He paused, thinking. "Yes, the $15 million federal grant from the Department of Transportation to link the Lower Plaza with the light rail station." "Exactly," I said. "Because the project is funded in part by federal money. Any false certification submitted to move the project forward constitutes a violation of the Federal False Claims Act. Under the qui tam provisions of Title 31, Section 3729. A private citizen can file a lawsuit on behalf of the government against contractors who commit fraud on public projects. Robert's eyes widened. A federal whistleblower suit. Yes, I said. My lawyer is filing the qui tam lawsuit under seal with the Department of Justice today. But more importantly, I am sending a complete package to Zurich American Insurance. They are the lead underwriters for the project's $120 million builder's risk insurance policy. Insurance companies do not care about developer promises or political connections. They only care about risk. If a building is constructed with uncertified steel and forged engineering stamps, their risk calculation goes to infinity. Under the terms of the builder's risk policy, the developer must maintain accurate structural records and follow all local building codes. A material misrepresentation of safety data is a breach of the insurance contract, allowing the insurer to void the policy immediately. Without a valid insurance policy, the lender, West Coast Syndicate, would be in violation of their own banking regulations. Their $90 million loan agreement had an automatic acceleration clause. No insurance meant no loan draws, and an immediate demand for repayment of the outstanding balance. I spent the rest of the afternoon in my home office, drafting the detailed report for the insurance underwriters. I attached the failed tension test reports, the photos of the red-marked steel, max delivery manifests, and the metadata proving the forged signature came from the Sterling server. I hit the send button at exactly 4 o'clock. The fuse was lit. On Monday morning, the storm hit the Sterling Heights construction site, but it did not come from the Seattle sky. It came in the form of 3 black SUVs parking outside the main project trailer. Out stepped 2 senior risk investigators from Zurich American Insurance, accompanied by an independent forensic structural engineer they had hired from a firm in Portland. They did not ask for Arthur Sterling's permission to inspect the site. Under the terms of the $120 million builder's risk policy, the insurer had the absolute right to conduct unannounced safety and structural audits at any time. When Arthur tried to block them from accessing the crane hoist to reach level 22, the lead investigator simply pulled out his phone and told Arthur that if they were not on the hoist in 2 minutes, the policy would be suspended immediately. By Tuesday afternoon, the hammer fell. Zurich American sent a formal notarized notice of cancellation to the headquarters of Sterling Structural Solutions, with a carbon copy sent directly to the Risk Management Department at West Coast Syndicate Bank. The language of the letter was devastating. The policy was voided immediately due to material misrepresentation of structural steel test data and the unauthorized, fraudulent use of the engineer of record's professional stamp. The bank's reaction was instantaneous. West Coast Syndicate's legal department issued an immediate freeze on the construction escrow account. The scheduled $3.5 million weekly draw for subcontractor payments and equipment rentals was blocked. The bank also sent a formal demand letter, giving Sterling Structural Solutions 10 business days to cure the default by replacing the insurance policy, under threat of loan acceleration and foreclosure. At 7 o'clock on Wednesday morning, Robert Chen's inspectors arrived at the site. They did not just write a citation. They posted large, bright red stop work order placards on the main gates, citing immediate structural safety hazards and lack of certified engineering oversight. For the first time in 3 years, the Sterling Heights site went completely silent. The massive tower crane stood motionless against the gray sky. The rumble of concrete mixers and the high-pitched whine of steel saws died down. The 100-foot-tall concrete core, which had been rising week by week, was suddenly just a silent, hollow monument to Arthur's greed. By Thursday, the subcontractors realized the money had stopped flowing. The word spread like wildfire through the trade unions that the building's structural core was compromised. The concrete subcontractor refused to send his crew back onto the deck of level 22, fearing a structural failure. The ironworkers' union pulled their men off the steel framing. By Friday afternoon, the site looked like a ghost town. Drywallers, electricians, and plumbers were packing their tools into their trucks and leaving the site in droves. That was when my phone started ringing. I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking a cup of coffee, when Arthur Sterling's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring. He called again 5 minutes later, and then again. On the fifth consecutive call, I picked up the digital recorder sitting on my desk, connected it to the phone line, and hit record. I slid the slide bar to answer. "Mark, thank God you picked up." Arthur's voice came through the speaker. He did not sound like the smug, arrogant executive who had thrown me out of his trailer a week ago. His voice was raw, frantic, and trembling. "What do you want, Arthur?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly calm. "Mark, we need to talk. We need to resolve this miscommunication," he said, his breathing heavy. "The city has shut us down. The bank has frozen the accounts. The subcontractors are walking off. It is a complete disaster." "That is not my problem, Arthur. I was fired, remember? You claimed I was extorting you." "Mark, listen to me," he pleaded, ignoring my comment. "I was under immense pressure. The milestone deadline was killing me. I made a mistake. I should not have listened to Gary. We can fix this. I am prepared to offer you a $2 million consulting contract. All you have to do is come back to the project, run some non-destructive testing on the level 22 columns, and sign a retroactive engineering variance stating that the steel is structurally acceptable under an alternative design method." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the digital recorder's indicator light, flashing. "An alternative design method?" I asked. "For 38 key-size steel and a high-rise core? Arthur, you know as well as I do that there is no engineering model in the world that justifies that under the Seattle Building Code. We can find an engineer to run the calculations, Mark. We just need your stamp as the original engineer of record to validate the previous submittals. We will pay you $1 million up front, and the other $1 million when the bank releases the next draw. You can retire. You can do whatever you want." "I need to understand what you are asking, Arthur," I said, leading him down the path. "You want me to sign off on a falsified report to cover up the fact that you took my digital PE stamp and forged my signature on the level 22 inspection submittal?" There was a long pause on the line. The sound of Arthur's heavy breathing was the only noise. "Yes," he finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I had to do it, Mark. If I didn't upload that report, the bank would have pulled the plug last week. I was trying to save the company. I was trying to save the project. Please, Mark, if you do not sign this variance, the bank is going to accelerate the loan. My family will lose everything. The company will go bankrupt. And what happens when a minor earthquake hits Seattle and those 45 stories pancake into the street because I signed a lie?" I asked. "It won't happen, Mark. It is a low probability," he stammered. I looked at the recorder. I had everything I needed. He had admitted to the forgery, the knowledge of the bad steel, and the attempted bribe all on tape. "The probability is irrelevant, Arthur," I said. "The answer is no. I will not sign the variance. I will not sign anything." "Mark, please. You are ruining my life," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "The time to think about that was before you forged my stamp, Arthur." "Talk to my lawyer." I hung up the phone. I stopped the recording, saved the audio file to an external drive, and emailed a copy to the federal prosecutor handling my qui tam case. The walls were closing in on Arthur Sterling, and he had just handed me the key to lock the door. The wheels of justice are notoriously slow in corporate cases, but when federal funds and building safety are involved, they can grind with terrifying speed. The recording of Arthur Sterling admitting to the forgery, combined with max-scale tickets and my laboratory test reports, left the Department of Justice with an open and shut case. 6 months after the stop work order was posted, a federal grand jury indicted Arthur Sterling on 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of mail fraud, and 1 count of aggravated identity theft for the forgery of my professional engineering stamp. Gary Thorne was indicted as a co-conspirator for mail fraud and supplying substandard materials to a federally funded project. Confronted with the mountain of evidence, Arthur's lawyers realized a trial would be a disaster. He pleaded guilty to wire fraud and identity theft in exchange for a reduced sentence. The judge, citing the potential loss of life had the tower been completed, sentenced Arthur to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Gary Thorne received 3 years. And his steel mill was liquidated to pay court fines. Sterling Structural Solutions declared Chapter 7, bankruptcy, shortly after the indictments were handed down. The primary lender, West Coast Syndicate Bank, foreclosed on the property, but they soon discovered they had seized a toxic asset, The physical reality of the tower was a structural nightmare. The level 22 core had been constructed with 38 Keisei steel columns, which were now buried under thousands of tons of concrete from the upper floors. To make the building structurally sound and compliant with the Seattle Building Code, a developer would have to demolish levels 22 through 24 and rebuild the core from the ground up. The cost of this selective demolition and remediation was estimated at $45 million, a sum that exceeded the value of the land itself. No structural engineer in the Pacific Northwest was willing to sign off on a remediation plan that kept the lower floors intact. The liability was simply too great. As a result, the project was abandoned. Today, the unfinished structure of Sterling Heights still stands in downtown Seattle, a half-finished, rusting steel skeleton surrounded by chain-link fencing, a monument to greed that no one can sell and no one can finish. For my role as the relator in the Qui Tam Whistleblower lawsuit, the payoff was substantial. The federal government successfully recovered the $15 million transit-oriented development grant from the liquidated assets of the developer and their insurance bonds. Under the False Claims Act, a whistleblower who provides original information that leads to a successful recovery is entitled to between 15 and 25% of the recovered funds. Because of the detail and quality of the evidence I provided, the federal judge awarded me the maximum 25% share. A check for $3.75 million, minus taxes and legal fees, was deposited directly into my account. I did not buy a luxury sports car, and I did not retire. Instead, I used the funds to establish Vance Structural Consulting. My firm specializes in forensic engineering, structural code compliance, and independent third-party peer reviews. We inspect projects for developers who actually care about their reputations and the safety of the people who will occupy their buildings. I hired 3 young, brilliant engineers who share my belief that structural engineering is a matter of public trust, not just a way to make a living. Yesterday morning, I walked down to the corner of 4th and Madison, holding a cup of hot coffee. I stood across the street from the fenced-off site of Sterling Heights, looking up at the rusting structure. The yellow tower crane had long been dismantled and sold off for scrap. The wind whistled through the open steel beams of the 22nd floor, and the concrete walls were stained gray by the constant Seattle's drizzle. As I stood there, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Arthur Sterling had told me that I was blacklisted and ruined, that I would never work in this city again. But his name was now on a cell block door, and his company was gone. My name was on the door of a thriving engineering firm, and my PE stamp was still active, clean, and respected. I took a sip of my coffee, turned my back on the rusted cage, and walked toward my office. There were new plans to review, calculations to check, and a city to keep safe.